Today is the first episode of our new series, AniLysis, and today's AniLysis is on what I consider to be the main character of the Animorphs series, and that is Jake Berenson. So let's cover Jake in as much detail as I think is necessary. First up, a general description, and I think the best way to start that is from book 4 by Cassie. He's very cute in a big, strong kind of way. He has brown hair and dark eyes. He seems very serious until you get to know him, and then you realise he's still pretty serious, but he also knows when to laugh. We meet a few members of Jake's family along the way, most noticeably Tom Berenson, who is Jake's brother, who turns out to be a relatively high-ranking Yeerk in the locality. Not quite a subvisor, not quite a lieutenant, as Chapman seems to be, but maybe a level below that. And the first Yeerk's name is Temrash, and I don't think we ever learn the second of Tom's Yeerk's name. But we also have Steve and Jean Berenson, his dad and mother respectively. And there's also Grandpa G, who we meet in book 31 and who is later mentioned again in book 47. Grandpa G dies sometime before book 31, which is where we get a lot of memories from him. And Grandpa G had a very interesting thing to say to Jake. Grandpa G sat him down in front of the lake where he lived and told him that he had an old soul. An old soul? I hadn't known what he meant then or why he'd said it. I don't know. Maybe he saw my future somehow. Because now I was old. You see too much pain and destruction, you get old inside. Aside from the physical characteristics that Cassie explained in book 4, the message and is in other places clarified in other books, one of the main distinguishing features about Jake as we progress through the series is how old he looks, how his eyes are sunken, how he seems to have just aged, and aged a lot. And that's a big part of his character, which we will cover in a bit more depth towards the end of this video, but it is one of the things that is brought up many times, the fact that Jake just seems to look older as things go on throughout the series. I think one of the things that separates Jake from basically any other character in the Animorphs series is he has probably the most solid and linear character arc. He goes from point A to point B, and there's very little confusion as to what those points are and how he gets there, as opposed to a character like Tobias or Marco, who for a large part, their character arcs are a bit confusing and they seem to go here, there and everywhere, which is why I believe a lot of Jake's books are much better on average than the books of other characters, because you know where he's going, you know how he's getting there, and you can see how each of his narrations plays into that larger character story. Jake starts off the series as what is essentially your average American boy, 13, 14 years old at the start of the series. He likes basketball, he likes comic books and video games and all that sort of stuff. Really sort of your lowest common denominator kid from the 90s, back before we all had mobile phones. But by the end of the series, he has possibly changed the most, at least in the head. You could obviously argue that Tobias changed the most from start to end, being a bird and all. But Jake's character goes from this average guy to being what is essentially, not technically, but basically a war veteran. An aged, wise, but guilt-ridden war veteran. And we see that from point 1 to point end in fine detail. And I think it is definitely the most interesting character development throughout the whole thing. It's decided at the very start of the series, in book 1, The Invasion, that Jake is to be the leader, and there's no real given explanation for this. But as we go through the book series, there are a few places here or there where the other characters acknowledge that Jake just has a firmer grip on these things than any of the others. And we see that come into play as we progress through the series, and he is, judging from my perspective, having read the books recently, he is definitely the best candidate for leader of the group. But he doesn't start as a leader. And part of his journey is starting from that position of having no leadership skills but being thrust into that position. His first priority when he starts being the leader of the Animorphs is a very personal goal, and that is to rescue his brother Tom Berenson, who they find out very quickly is a member of the Yeerk invasion force. For example, at the end of the invasion, he takes on the following action. I saw Tom stagger from the Visser's blow. I saw him fall from the edge of the stairs. I went a little crazy. I was on the Visser before I knew what was happening. For at least the first third of the book series, Tom is Jake's main priority, and he states it multiple times. But as we get further into the series, the idea of saving Tom drifts away from him, until we get to book 31, The Conspiracy, where the climax of the book is Jake deciding that he needs to kill his brother Tom. This character who from the very start was his main priority to save his brother. By the time we get halfway through the series, that priority has switched. And we see more of that as we approach the end of the series, where, spoiler alert, he does kill Tom, indirectly, but he does send Rachel to kill Tom. And his objectives become much more objective rather than personal. And we see that in book 47, The Resistance, to a great degree. Notice in book 47 how the Visser, at the end of the book, goes into exactly the same morph that he did back in book 1 when he attacked Tom, or when Tom attacked him. In the same morph, and this is what happens. The Visser's monster morph stomped closer to the fleeing Hulkbegeer. No choice. I charged, and in one gigantic leap, I smashed into the Visser, sank my 9-centimeter fangs into one of the monster's 8 serpentine necks. Notice the parallel there and the difference between the two scenarios. His priorities have changed because in book 47, The Resistance, when that's all going on, Jake has started to manipulate those people around him, starting off with the Free Hulkbegeer. This change from a more personal to a more objective Jake starts, I believe, in book 16, The Warning, appropriately titled, because there we figure out that Jake is coming to terms with being the leader, and that he is going to have to make difficult decisions and make them sometimes hastily, impulsively. And that means sometimes pushing aside your principles, which is not a very nice thing, I'm sure you'll agree. But Jake starts to do it from book 16 onwards. I make mistakes. I fail sometimes. Sometimes I'm just plain stupid. Sometimes there is no right answer to the problems we face. But what can you do but keep trying to figure out the answer out anyway? What else can you do? Only a few books later we get the David trilogy. And at the end of that book, probably one of the biggest decisions that Jake has to make of many big decisions. And he doesn't do it lightly either, entrapping David in Ratmorph and abandoning him on an island. And that's with his go-ahead. He is the leader, he is responsible. The first time they really have to abandon their principles in order to protect themselves and the people around them. Once we get past that hurdle of Jake knowing that he has to be the one to make the decisions, which he saw in books 16 and 21 and 22, he then has to deal with his team, which should seem simple on the surface, but when you've got people in your team such as Cassie and Marco, two completely opposite sides of the spectrum, maybe more likely Cassie and Rachel, he's got to be the one to balance them out, and he does struggle with it. And that's, I believe, the big underlying thing that's coming across in book 36, The Mutation, where at the start of the book, he acts on the wrong impulse, and that is playing into Cassie's rage when she finds out that Visser 3 has been mutating some of the hosts and ends up killing them in these experiments. He sees sees how upset she is and decides to use that as a reason to go into a dangerous situation in which he doesn't know the way out or what to do. That book is largely about him learning to balance that against his more patient side, which we also saw when the team were caught in the net with the Narthex, another bad mistake, but of the opposite sort. He needs to find a way to bring that all together into a point. Book 41 is often seen as a filler book, as a not a very good book, although I will say after my recent ranking of the books, there was actually quite a lot of positive comments regarding The Familiar, so it might actually be more popular than I give it credit for, but it is one of my favourites, and it was so important to Jake's character. It's largely a dream sequence, so up to this point, Jake has accepted his role as leader. His priorities have changed to somewhat of a more objective stance, but still with a lot of his principles intact, and he's starting to learn to control the more extreme aspects of his own team. Book 41 is largely a dream sequence looking at the future, what's going on around him now and how it could change things in the future, but he also sees glimpses of his past, what he's done, the guilt he holds. And this is all going through his head, and by the end of that book, he has to make a big decision. Does he throw aside the people that he loves in order to save what is effectively the world? Or does he save the ones he loves and screw the rest of the world? We never truly find out what his answer was, at least not definitely, but we can be pretty sure that when given the choice between saving the one he loved and saving everything else, he chose the everything else option. And this is a big turning point, I think, for Jake. I know that we've had the Tom thing before, where Tom is technically an enemy of Jake. Not the actual Tom, but the physical form of Tom is the enemy. So there's sort of a grey area there. Now Jake is at the point where he knows the people he loves and who he can trust, his allies, are also in the firing line. Pawns on a chessboard. And if we take that idea forward into book 47, then we see a bigger picture emerging. I mentioned earlier using the Hawk-Bajir to his advantage. This is what he does in this book. Part of it is when he's talking to Toby, and she chastises him for not giving the Hawk-Bajir the respect that they deserve. And the reason that is important is because Jake knows that's a failing on his part, and so he tries to turn that around. The reason the Animorphs fight with the Hawk-Bajir in the valley when they could easily have run the other way is because he knows they're an important chess piece, and he needs to earn their respect to remain on that chessboard, and they of course become vital to the end of the series. Jake, much like Isaiah Fitzhenry in book 47, one of his old ancestors, gathers as many people as he can. He uses whatever means necessary to bring all his allies together to keep them in tow to fight off the oncoming forces. That's what Jake's plan is after book 41 going into book 47. Two incredibly important books, and actually my top two favourite books. I think this is the right time now to talk about one of the more intimate relationships in the Animorphs series, Jake and Cassie. These two have been a relationship basically from the start. I guess you could say I kind of like Cassie. Sometimes we sit together on the bus, even though I never know what to say to her. So there were inklings of this being a relationship from the start. It was actually solidified in book 25, The Extreme, where Jake and Cassie exchanged their first kiss. And this relationship continues until near enough the end of the series. But one of the things that emerged towards the end, after book 47, is that Jake starts to manipulate her, the one that he loves, into doing what is required for his bigger goal. This happens shortly after Cassie gives Tom the morphing cube. Quite a lot recently, Cassie has been ducking out of missions. Book 44 was a slight turning point for her, but Jake obviously didn't see that, and Cassie still has the biggest moral compass of the group. Jake starts to fake cutting himself off from the group and deciding to give up that leadership role. He had a private talk with Cassie in book 50, The Ultimate, and he says, "I'm not doing this anymore." Cassie, at the end of that book, does everything that Jake says, despite her previous arguments against it. This, I believe, was all a play by Jake. Cut himself away, make Cassie panic, and because she's panicking, she eventually decides, okay, I'm going to do what he says to give him that boost, which is what we see at the meeting that they have in book 50 in the woods. So the character of Jake at the start of the series was essentially trying to appease everybody and struggling to do so. Now at this stage of the books, he's gone to the point where he's manipulating those closest to him for his bigger goals. And that is, I believe, the climax of his character. And we cannot forget what happened at the end of the series regarding his family as well, whereas Marco and Tobias regained family that they had lost at the start of the war or before the war. Jake loses his parents to the Yerks, Tom is killed, and his relationship with Cassie ends. He ends up alone, largely because of the decisions that he's made. But in doing so, he essentially saved the planet. So if we go back to that situation in book 40 on the Familiar, where he's got a choice of saving the one he loves and the big abort button to stop the massive invasion thing going on, we get the real life version of that at the end of this, where basically all of his loved ones are gone, but he's done his job. He's done what he needed to do, but in that, he's sacrificed everything that he holds dear to himself. The ultimate hero story. Giving up yourself for the good of everyone else around you. But in doing this mega heroic thing, he does some pretty dickish things as well. As I said, manipulating those around him in order to achieve those goals. It then becomes a question of what's good or bad about that? Is that right or wrong? Manipulating somebody for their own good. Is it right? Is it wrong? It's a big moral grey area, which Animorphs does quite a lot, and I think this is one of the bigger ones that sometimes gets overlooked. Remember that Jake is probably the least popular of the Animorphs main cast. He's not the most disliked, but he's certainly the least favourite. The one that... basically, a poll. Pick your favourite Animorph. Every time I've seen it, Jake has been bottom. He's been the lowest. That's... doesn't deserve it. Jake deserves better. Isn't that right, Sean? He agrees with me over there.
Axe is cooler.
Axe is not cooler.
Axe is cooler.
The woman is interfering in the video again. I've been thinking about the larger meta message of Jake's character that we can relate to as we're growing up in this world. I think it's largely about growing up. Simple as that, growing up. Going from an innocent kid to being an adult with guilt, issues, just awful memories of what's gone on before, and the loss of those around to help you. Jake, of course you've got the metaphors of him always looking older, this, that and the other. For example, Jake was still carrying the world on his shoulders, and it showed. It's about gaining responsibility as you grow older. Jake losing his parents could be the same as somebody moving out on their own. Going out into the real world, suddenly you've been given all of these responsibilities, and it can be quite hard to handle if you aren't used to it. Jake has to be the one to make the tough decisions. He's doing everything solo, essentially. Going from this kid who's being looked after, he's got all his friends around him, his family, and everything's going great. And then suddenly, that's all taken away, and he has to fend for himself and make some pretty cold decisions. I think all of us in adult life have to make these rational, cold decisions from one time to another. Not to the same extent that Jake does, of course, being in a war. But is there a metaphor for growing up, taking on these responsibilities, and getting older? Another message I get from Jake is the idea of bouncing back. So every time Jake seems to fail, it seems to be a point where he takes the next step into being a leader and taking responsibility. He seems to fall to that lowest point, like in book 16, where he doesn't know what to do, he's having a bit of a breakdown, and then suddenly, bang, he goes to that next step higher, and he's able to maintain that. It seems to happen every time. It's always darkest before the dawn, you know, that sort of thing. That seems to be a large part. And it's about getting back up when you've been knocked down, when you've faced a losing situation where you're pushed down, something's not gone right. You get back up again and you aim to do better. I get that message from the Jake story arc. And he is the hero of the series, I think. He starts the series, he doesn't exactly end, well, he does end the series. He starts and ends the series. He's got the most linear character arc, but also, somehow, the most interesting character arc, in my opinion. He hasn't got... Is the Forgotten Filler book? Maybe. But I think he has got the best range of books. And he is my favourite character. Hence why I wanted to analyse him first in this AniLysis series. If there's anything you want to add, please put it into the comments below. I'd love for this to be your space now to say what you want about Jake. What are your thoughts on him, your opinions? Is there something I've missed, a message somewhere that you think can be gleaned from Jake's character, or anything else like that? Please put it in the comments below. I shall do another AniLysis video sometime in the future, and I don't know what it's going to be on yet. It could be on anything. I could analyse the dome ships, I could analyse Tony. I think he was in book 20, just that guy. I can analyse anything. I might do a hat draw or something like that, I don't know. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. I hope you've learnt something new about Jake today. Please comment below and all the rest of the YouTube bollocks. Thank you for watching, and I shall see you next time. Ta-ra.